So then, we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant on the Aramaic English translation of the Word. This translation comes from the original documents and manuscripts of the prophets of old, from the time of Israel, from the prophets of Yahweh, giving us then the directives that we must understand at the end of time. So then, the Messiah spoke many words during the time of the completion of the spring feast. And when he came, he was then expected to find the city that was closed, because the whole purpose of his coming and completing the spring feast was then for his people, when they were then, let's say, if they were found in seclusion as they were told to be secluded, then it would be a whole lot easier for them to go out then in sets of people and forming holy lands around the world, or then the holy cities. However, when the Messiah came, he found then a city that was not secluded, but a city that was very dirty, a city that was then involved with the many pagan nations, and he could not perform the completing of the spring feast as per the design. We understand he came and he completed the spring feast. This is a fact. He then, however, was expecting prior of coming, finding a city that was precisely on a desert, so then he would transfer then the anointing in a much easier way and environment. However, the people, they were not then obedient during the time of his coming. So then, what we perceive today as people being obedient may not be where they are thinking of. Because the situation as then during the time of the Messiah, when he came and he found the city not closed, not secluded, as they were told to do. So today, when these people then, either from the set apart or then Gentiles, they think in a certain way how heaven should be. What they think then, because of the flow with the world, what the way of their beliefs should be, and in reality it is not. For instance, the set apart, they think every Shabbat they should get together and such and should read. That's very positive. But in terms of the city being secluded, is the city being secluded? Are they obedient to what the Messiah told them to do? Go around the world and form holy cities? No, they are not obedient. And then from the part of the Gentiles, are they being obedient to what the Messiah said, reporting at the holy gates for further instructions? Are they being obedient? No. So both sides, when they begin to think if they are obedient or not, whatsoever activity they are engaged on, it's truly a waste of time. Though it is nice for a person to spend time reading, it's positive. Coming together and reading, it's positive. Sharing with each other, it's positive. But are they doing then what the Messiah told them to do? No. So what does it do? So then the Messiah, he was explaining of the provision then he gave when he died in his holy dam, then was the very portion of himself where his people would then be pardoned or forgiven of their sins and cleansed. So then he provided also a plan so a person could be involved in certain areas where they would maintain their loyalty, but a loyalty based upon the truth, not based upon old habits. In other words, if you think then you are a Gentile and you don't understand the holy cities, then what you believe, it's not true. Because the Messiah told his people first, go around the world and form holy cities. and then engaged in the second tabernacle services, and then the Gentiles should report as often, and then would receive ministrations. Do you want the truth? So this truly is the truth. So they set apart, spending time in their synagogues and not forming holy cities, doesn't amount very much. Gentiles going to churches and frauding around and reading scandalized scriptures, it doesn't amount very much. But either side, whatsoever they think it is heaven's purpose, truly it is not. Because the Messiah told them, the set apart must go around the world and form the holy cities, and the Gentiles, they should report to these cities and be shepherded by the set apart and receive ministrations. That's the truth of it. Now, either side, when they are might and height, in other words, they are so short of themselves, going around and doing what the world's flow is saying for them to do, they can't be mistaken, because what they are doing is not true. The Messiah was very specific. He told the set apart, not the Gentiles. He told the set apart, the Hebraic people, go around the world and form holy cities. Exercise what they had learned. Comes from Matthew, the 23rd chapter. Whatsoever Moses told you to do and observe, these do and observe. Then, what the Messiah taught them, in terms of the first anointing for the second service, then they would go around the world forming holy cities. And then the Gentiles should be shepherded. In what form? Receiving ministrations from the set apart. The plan of salvation. However, many people are doing it on their own. They think they can go around hurting people so they can get away with it. And then at the end. So then the Messiah said, if you go with the flow for so often, what is then for you if you own the entire world and then your soul gets lost at the end? So then the Messiah spoke very precisely, and he said, he who desires to save his life wilt then lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake wilt find it. For what does it profit a person if gain the worlds, or then the world, and loses his soul? Because at the end, going with the flow does not do the work. Because the world is aware of is very disobedient. And whatsoever they think is of divine, it is not. Because the Messiah said to the set apart, go around the world, form holy cities, and then Gentiles would be shepherded. As we understand from Yeshayahu, the 61st chapter, then time of restoration. And the Messiah has provided his holy dam so he can restore. So then we understand we are during the time of restoration. War is prohibited. Time for restoration. Then earlier, Yeshayahu 1:8, he states, then tabernacling later amongst the fierce. Then the land of Cush, beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. As we understand, the area over there was very fertile during the time, and it is fertile these days. But then the returning of the holy cities, that's the most important. Because the time of the deceit is over with, ended in 2009 or 6009, per the Creator's calendar. And Gentiles, if they don't understand the truth, so so they can base their bearings, their understandings, is always pushing for another city. So then understand the words of the city. Let's verify what Shaul the Shaliach tried to speak with his set apart when he was giving directives related with the cities. In Hebrews 11 you find, very interestingly, a section of it speaking of the cities. As we understand, from the time of the desert came the city of God, or the city of Yahweh, on a desert. Later, the city was then, there was simply a transfer of the city from the desert onto the promised land, and they trained for more than 1,000 years for the coming of the Mashiach. So then later they would go around the world forming holy cities. So let's verify what then Shaliach Shaul is explaining to the Levitical priests is what it means, because Shaliach Shaul was explaining the mysteries or the revealing of the Torah to the Levites, so then they could perform the second services. Have in mind, he is speaking from the time of a transition, from the first service and the second service. So then, he explains in terms of the city. Hebrews 11 is a chapter of then believing what the Messiah said, simply. Then he explains, these then died in belief and did not receive their promise, but they saw it from distance and rejoiced in it, and then they testify that they were the strangers and pilgrims on the earth. They then who say thus show that they were in search for the city. What Shaul is explaining is this. During the time of the Exodus from Egypt, we can understand that they were, in quotes, searching for the city. They did not have a clue yet during the time that they would be parked in a desert and then would form a holy city. But this is the content of what then Shaliach Shaul is explaining to the Levitical priests, always wishing for the city. But if they had then searching for the city that they came out of, then he is speaking of a second city. They left the city in a desert, then came another city. The Messiah brought then the cities. Always understand the context. Then, from the city that came out of it, and they would return to the city, and then he is speaking of a returning of the city that's coming from heaven. Because the analogy is this. The Levitical priests, they were spiritual people dealing with the spiritual situations every time, because they were engaged in services of the Holy Tabernacle. So then, when they were during the time of the holy city in the desert, they were performing then their services, they were always related with the heavens city. Later then became the cities, because the Messiah brought the first anointing for the second service. Always wishing for then the returning of the city, speaking of the future then, when Jerusalem would be coming from heaven. In Levitical understanding, those are related, because they are always in the presence of Yahweh, always in the presence of God. So then that's why he explains then the many facets of this city, though they are the same understanding, heaven's viewpoint, however distinct times and places as then the reader begins to read. So then he speaks of the city in the desert, and then he's always wishing for the city, because then you have to read then in layers. There is a layering over there explaining to you then the perfect city. The perfect city, as we understand today, would be then the city coming from heaven. However, the priests or the Levites, they did not know it, because the oracles were not yet revealed. That's why Shaliach Shaul is revealing. So the reference point in Shaliach Shaul's mind is the city yet to come from heaven. That's future after the vengeance, or after the autumn feast. Then he explains, obviously, the first understanding is the city on a desert. They were familiar with it. Then later, he had to explain the cities, because of the second tabernacle services. Became the city, but then always wishing for that city, or the city to come from heaven. So then he explains what those mean. So then what does it say to us? Gentiles then, they always should be wishing for the city to come from heaven. It's obvious, because we are being prepared for the autumn feast. And after the autumn feast then comes the restoration of the planet, then comes the new Jerusalem, where Yahweh said then they would come in to participate in the feasts. Read Yeshayahu the 66th chapter. If you don't like the feasts, you don't like the Shabbats, or the lunar views, or participating in the feasts, then not sure what you are going to be doing in the new earth, because that's precisely what Yahweh said that He would be performing. The 66th chapter of Yeshayahu gives you what it is when the earth is then renewed, and then Jerusalem is the capital of the world. Nations would go to Jerusalem to worship. If you don't like the feasts, you don't like then the lunar views, or you don't like then the holy mikras, then what are you going to be doing in the new earth? That's why what people perceive as being heaven truly is not. So then he is explaining how the people should be thinking. Always wishing for the city. At the moment we understand we are doing the restoration of the cities, and then later the city. Gentiles should always pushing forward for the set apart to form holy cities. Obviously. Please stay tuned. Much more coming up, because then this understanding of the cities was given then to the Levites, and those are very precise, so a person must understand how to make a delineation of those layers. So then later in Revelation then you understand when the city from heaven comes, and that's precisely what Shaul the Shaliach then is emphasizing. Please stay tuned.